I'm Marian Keller, I'm 64 years old and I live in Dayton, Ohio. On the night of my birthday, I stood under the yellow light above the table and listened to the sugar shell on the cake tighten and split in a line so fine I could barely see it. The roast had gone gray around the edges, the peas had skinned over. Outside, a car passed too fast on wet pavement, and for one foolish second I thought it might be my family turning in. It wasn't. I kept one hand on the back of a chair, not because I was weak, but because the room had started to feel a little tilted. By then I had stopped checking my phone. By then I had stopped making excuses for people who were not on their way. I remember the house breathing around me in its usual sounds, and I remember how strange it was that something so ordinary could make a person feel so completely erased. For most of my life, I believed love looked like routine, not grand speeches, not flowers appearing for no reason, just a set of steady hands doing the same caring thing over and over until everybody else could lean on it without asking where it came from. Mine were those hands. I liked that about myself. I liked being the one who remembered the extra napkins in the lunch sacks, who knew which child hated onions and which one wanted the crust cut off even after he was old enough to drive. Our little brick house on Ashbury Lane used to wake up in layers. First the furnace kicking once in winter, then the coffee perking in its glass-bellied pot, then the sound of my own slippers crossing linoleum before the sun had made up its mind. Harold liked bacon crisp enough to snap. Rachel wanted scrambled eggs so soft they barely held together. Daniel would eat anything if I put hot sauce near his elbow. I kept those facts in my body the way other women kept him verses. There was comfort in being useful. There was pride in knowing exactly how a morning should move. I worked payroll for a plumbing supply company on the north side of town. Nothing glamorous. Steel desks, fluorescent hum, the copy room always too cold. I drove the same route every weekday, past the car wash with the hand-painted sign, past the tire shop with the giant rubber mascot pitched forward like it had something urgent to say. I packed my lunch in a square vinyl carrier and carried peppermints in my coat pocket for the drive home. By 5:30 I was back in my own kitchen, tying an apron around my waist, turning chopped celery into soup or flour into biscuits or hamburger into something 3 people, and then 4 and then 6 could gather around. I didn't think of it as sacrifice then. That word felt too polished, too pleased with itself. It was just how I had been built. My mother was the same way. She could iron a shirt while talking to the insurance company and still remember to stir a pot with her free hand. She taught me that running a home wasn't a performance, it was maintenance, quiet work, the kind that only got noticed when it stopped. When the children were small, I used to believe steadiness could fix almost anything. A fever, a slammed door, a bad report card, a husband coming home short-tempered from a week of inventory and invoices. If I kept the house warm, if I kept supper regular, if I made things smooth enough, surely the people inside it would stay soft toward one another. That was the bargain I made without ever saying it out loud. One winter afternoon, years before I understood what that bargain would cost, I walked to St. Anne's Hospital alone with a pain stabbing low in my side and my coat buttoned wrong because my fingers shook too much to do it carefully. Harold was on a job in Springfield. Rachel had the flu at my sister's. Daniel was in school. I remember the sidewalks glittering with old salt and the ache of each block, and I remember stepping through those sliding doors by myself because no one came. They took my gallbladder out that evening. By breakfast the next day, I was already telling the nurse I'd be fine to go home. Back then, I treated that like proof of strength. I wore it that way. There were good years too, real ones. Saturday afternoons with a radio game on and tomato vines bowing under their own weight. Daniel laughing so hard milk came out his nose. Rachel curling against me on the couch with damp hair smelling like apple shampoo after swim lessons. Harold, before the distance set in, carrying grocery sacks in with both arms full and nudging the door shut with his boot. I am not interested in rewriting every kindness just because of what came later. Some things were tender when they happened. That matters. What I didn't know yet, what I couldn't have known, was how easily a life built on being depended on can turn into a life where no one bothers to ask what you need. The years of giving didn't arrive all at once. They stacked. That's the part people miss. They imagine one huge moment where a woman disappears into everybody else. It's smaller than that. It's tea. Earning around on your way upstairs because somebody called your name. It's staying awake until the washer finishes because a grandson needs his uniform in the morning. It's cutting your own slice thinner so the last piece can go in a paper towel for somebody rushing out the door. One night near Christmas, when Daniel was still working second shift at the warehouse and Rachel was trying to finish nursing school with a baby on her hip, I stood over the stove close to midnight making 3 lasagnas at once because one was for our house, one was for Rachel's freezer, and one was for Daniel to take to a church potluck he had forgotten about until 9:40. The noodles kept sliding out of my grip because my hands were slick from rinsing spinach, and the oven made the whole room feel tropical in December. I could hear Harold snoring in the bedroom with the television still on, and I kept layering sauce anyway, telling myself this was what families did when life got crowded. Nobody asked whether I had to be up at 6. I didn't ask either. The appointment I skipped was a mammogram. Wednesday, 2:15 p.m. I had written it on the little card the clinic mailed, then tucked the card under a magnet shaped like a peach. That same morning, Rachel called crying because Owen had croup and the sitter refused to take him coughing like that. I heard the panic in her voice and said I'd come by after lunch. I never made it to the imaging center. Instead, I sat in her apartment patting a hot child's back while a cartoon fox sang about vegetables from the television. Later, I called the clinic to reschedule, but I got put on hold so long my lunch break ended, and then another month went by and then another. You can tell yourself a woman chooses these things. Sometimes she does. Sometimes she has simply been trained to treat herself as movable. The bill I paid in silence was Daniel's electric. He didn't ask in so many words. He sent a text that said, "They're threatening shut off again," followed by a sad face emoji that somehow made it worse. I looked at my own account during my break, saw the number in it, thought about the leaking gutter we still hadn't fixed, and paid his balance before the service counter closed. When he called 2 days later, he talked for 10 minutes about a transmission problem and never mentioned the lights. Maybe he thought Harold had done it. Maybe he knew it was me and couldn't bear the shame of saying thank you. Either way, that money left my hands without a sound. Then came the spring. I got sick for 3 weeks and nobody called. Bronchitis first, then an infection that dropped me so flat I could hardly make it from bed to the bathroom without stopping halfway. My voice turned to paper. My ribs hurt from coughing. I kept the phone by my pillow because the children were used to checking in when they needed recipes or favors or addresses from old files I still kept in a labeled box. Those calls never came. Rachel was busy with Owen's ear tubes. Daniel had picked up overtime. Harold slept in the den because he said my coughing kept him awake. By the second week, I started waiting for the screen to light up with a name from my own family the way some people watch for weather to change. It stayed dark. On day 21, I drove myself to urgent care and lied when the nurse asked if someone could bring me home. There were birthdays I spent wrapping presents for grandchildren before my own card got opened. Thanksgivings where I ate standing up between trips from counter to table. Sundays I ironed church shirts I would never wear because I was home washing the pans afterward. I am not saying no one ever thanked me. They did, sometimes. What I am saying is that gratitude became another thing I served, received, and cleared away before it had time to feed me. Harold got used to saying, "Your mother's got it," as though I were not a person but a reliable service. Daniel got used to leaving coolers by the back step when he wanted something cooked low and slow for a tailgate. Rachel got used to dropping off grocery lists that somehow turned into my grocery bill. Even Owen, sweet as he was, learned young that Grandma would say yes before the whole question was out of his mouth. I helped build that expectation. I can admit that now. The strange thing about overgiving is how clean it can look from the outside. The lawn is cut, the roast is done, the kids still come by. People see a woman at the center of her family and call her lucky. They do not see the little ledger inside her chest, the one that keeps adding numbers no one else knows are there. By then mine was getting heavy. I told myself it was enough. I was lying. The shift in the house started with details so small I felt foolish noticing them. Harold began taking calls on the back step, even in weather that made his ears go red. Rachel started texting him directly about family plans instead of the group thread that used to include me. Daniel came by one Saturday afternoon and lowered his voice when he realized I was in the pantry. Not silent exactly, just lowered, enough to tell me my presence had become something to manage. One evening I came home from work and found Harold's phone lying face down beside the sink. That alone meant nothing. Everybody does that now. Still, something in the angle of it unsettled me, like a picture hung half an inch crooked. I chopped carrots for stew while listening to him shower upstairs, and I became aware of how carefully quiet the house felt, how every sound seemed to stop right before it might explain itself. She had known for 2 years. I didn't know that fact then, of course. I only knew the air had changed. Rachel's laugh got thinner around me. Daniel quit asking if I needed anything from the store, which was never about the store. It was about whether he saw me as someone who might have needs of her own. Harold began coming home already full, saying he'd grabbed a sandwich out with the guys, though his breath sometimes held wine instead of beer. New things, small things. Enough of them and your body learns before your mind is willing to admit it. Something in me knew. I just wasn't ready to name it yet. There had been years after the children moved out and before the grandchildren made a habit of coming over, when I lived alone in a big quiet house for long stretches because Harold traveled for inventory audits and trade shows. I learned then how a hallway sounds when no one has crossed it since morning. I learned the little mechanical groans a home makes settling into evening. Back then the quiet felt lonely sometimes, but never hostile. Now it had edges. The kitchen smelled like burnt coffee that morning. I don't know why I remember that. Maybe because it was the first day I watched Rachel come in, kiss the air beside my cheek instead of my actual skin, and begin unloading a worry she clearly meant for Harold. She asked whether the papers had been looked at. He said, "Not yet," without glancing at me. Then Daniel arrived with a paper sack of muffins for Owen and asked if Dad was free later. Everybody kept talking around some center they had agreed not to name in front of me. I stirred chili on the stove and felt like a woman standing just outside a lit window, able to see movement but not hear the words. That fall, Harold started shutting the den door, not slamming it, just closing it softly with the kind of politeness that says a boundary has been placed where none used to be. He began taking Saturday drives without mentioning where he was headed. Rachel stopped leaving Owen with me automatically and started asking first, which sounds considerate until you hear the strain in it, the fear that I might have plans interfering with whatever had been set in motion without my vote. Daniel, who used to let himself in through the side door, began knocking. He didn't wait for the answer, he just knocked. I sat there thinking I was the problem. Maybe I had been, but not in the way I thought. For a while I wondered if I had become difficult without noticing. Maybe I was too tired, maybe I complained more than I meant to. Maybe age had made me slower, easier to work around them with. These are the bargains women strike with confusion. We take other people's secrecy and tailor it into self-blame because it fits faster than anger does. It took me time to understand that not being consulted is not the same thing as having done something wrong. On the morning of my birthday, I woke before dawn and lay still long enough to hear rain ticking against the gutter. 64, not a milestone people throw parties for, but enough of a year to deserve a meal around a table. Rachel had said she'd bring Owen after soccer. Daniel promised to come straight from work. Harold told me not to make anything complicated, which I heard, as I always had, as permission to make something nice anyway. So I browned onions for pot roast, peeled carrots, set dough to rise for dinner rolls, and mixed a coconut cake because that had been my favorite since I was 12 and no one in my family could ever remember it without help. By noon I had already worked a half shift because payroll closed that day no matter whose birthday it was, and I had kept working even when there was nothing left in me but habit and Tylenol. My lower back throbbed, my feet felt hot inside my shoes. Still, after I got home, I changed clothes, pinned up my hair, and finished supper because that was what I did. That was what I had always done. A person can mistake endurance for meaning if she lives inside it long enough. At 6:30 I lit the candles on the cake just to see how it looked. At 7 I turned the roast down. At 7:15 Rachel texted, running a little behind. At 7:40 Daniel sent a thumbs up. At 8:10 Harold still wasn't home, though he'd left work early. I stood at the counter pressing my fingernail into the edge of the icing, then smoothing it over again. Like I could flatten time itself if I stayed busy. What I didn't know yet, what I couldn't have known, was that the worst part hadn't even started. At 8:27, Owen sent a message to the family thread by mistake. Just 4 words, "Are you all inside?" There was a photo attached, blurred by motion, showing a carpeted room, white tablecloths, and the sleeve of Harold's blue sport coat at the edge. My breath stopped so suddenly it felt less like shock than like missing a step in the dark. I stared at that picture until Rachel deleted it. Too late. I got my keys. I didn't cry. I didn't call. Rain striped the windshield all the way to Belmont House, the steak place on Wilmington where Harold liked to say the portions were honest. I parked badly, I remember that, crooked across the line like I no longer belonged to orderly things. The private dining room was at the back, behind a folding partition printed with vines trying too hard to look expensive. I stood there 1 second before pushing through. Inside, everybody went still. Harold at the head of the table, Rachel with her lipstick glass set near her plate, Daniel bent over a manila folder, a woman from some realty office in a fitted blazer, papers spread in front of her. There was a candle in the center, already burned halfway down, and a basket of bread torn into. I said, "So this is where you are." Harold looked up first, not guilty, annoyed. "Marion." Rachel sat straighter. "Mom, we were going to call." "It's after 8:30. Daniel rubbed his forehead and stared at the papers instead of me. The woman in the blazer started gathering folders into a neat stack. Harold held up a hand to stop her. "You might as well stay." I walked closer. My name sat on the top sheet in typed black letters. Under it was an appraisal estimate for my mother's lake cottage in Salina, the only property ever left to me alone. There were notes in the margin about listing timelines, tax implications, and family redistribution. My birthday dinner, apparently, had been a planning session for spending what was mine. I said, "Who gave you access to this?" Harold answered before anyone else could, "We've all talked about it." That wasn't my question. Rachel leaned forward. "Mom, Daniel's behind on the mortgage and daycare for Owen is going up again. This just makes sense." "For whom?" Daniel finally lifted his eyes. "We need a reset." I touched the top page with one finger as if that might tell me how real it was. "You were going to sell my mother's place without asking me." Harold's jaw tightened. "We were going to ask you when there was something concrete." "You have my name typed on a listing packet." He exhaled through his nose. "It's family." I heard my own voice go very flat. "My birthday is family too." Nobody answered that, not one of them. Rachel reached for her purse, then stopped with her hand still hovering. Daniel's leg bounced once under the tablecloth. The woman in the blazer looked at the centerpiece like she wished she were anywhere else. Harold said, "Don't make this dramatic." That was the coldest line of the whole night, not because he raised his voice. He didn't. He said it the way a person comments on traffic, like my presence was the inconvenience. I looked at Rachel. "You knew." Her eyes dropped. I looked at Daniel. "You sat here and let this happen." He swallowed. "Dad said you'd understand once it was laid out." Then I looked at Harold, the man I had fed for 38 years, and said, "You left me at home waiting." He gave the smallest shrug. "We needed to talk without interruption." There are sentences that split your life cleanly in two. That was one of mine. No one apologized, no one stood up, no one pushed a chair back and said my name like it belonged to a person they loved. I stayed there long enough to see the truth of that, then I turned around and walked out of the room. Outside the partition, a busboy wheeled past a cart of cloudy water and stacked tumblers. One lemon wedge floated on top, bright as a warning. I drove without deciding where to go and ended up at Eastwood Metro Park, in the lot near the old boathouse where everything looked silver under the lot lamps. The rain had thinned to mist. I sat on a splintered bench under the overhang and held my hands between my knees because they would not stop trembling. Across the dark water, somebody's dock light blinked once and went out. My throat hurt, but I still didn't cry. There was a vending machine by the restroom with a row of peanut crackers behind scratched glass. I stared at it so long the whole world seemed to narrow down to those little orange packets and the hum behind them. On my lap sat the paper napkin I had grabbed from the restaurant without remembering it. I kept folding it smaller and smaller until it tore. That was all my body could manage at first, not grief in words, grief in tiny ruined things. A woman should not have to become invisible before her own family. Why notices she is gone? I don't know how long I stayed there. Long enough for the overhead light outside the restroom to click off on its timer, long enough for the mist to gather on my sleeves, long enough for the hunger in my stomach to turn from appetite into nausea. I finally opened my purse and found an old peppermint stuck to the lining. I unwrapped it with clumsy fingers and let it dissolve on my tongue because it was the only thing I had. That taste, sweet, sharp, almost medicinal, felt more honest than the dinner waiting back at my house. When I got home, I did not go into the dining room. I took off my wet shoes in the hallway and stood in the dark front room listening. Harold was not back yet. The silence no longer felt confusing. That was the difference. It had shape now. It had intention. The truth did not arrive like lightning. No choir of understanding. No dramatic collapse. It came quietly, the way morning makes itself known first in the corners. I sat at the kitchen table before dawn with a legal pad in front of me and saw, with a calm that surprised me, that I had spent most of my life waiting for decency to appear where convenience had settled in instead. The day I knew nobody was coming to save me had happened long before my birthday. I was 16, standing in my mother's yard after my father drove off for good, watching her drag a trash barrel to the curb with one wrist wrapped in an old dish towel because she'd strained it at work and still had supper to make. No one came down the street. No uncle, no pastor, no miracle, just my mother setting her mouth and doing the next thing. I remembered that morning all at once, not as sadness but as instruction. Some truths wait years before they become useful. She had moved on before the world gave her permission. I made coffee and didn't drink it. I took out a pen from the junk drawer, the cheap kind from a bank, and for the first time in months my hand felt steadier than the rest of me. I didn't write about betrayal. I didn't write about fairness. Those words were too swollen to help. Instead, I wrote 3 plain things in block letters: separate, gather, leave. I looked at them until they stopped feeling impossible. That morning Harold came in around 7, smelling faintly of char and onion and rain-damp wool. He started to say something about the restaurant. I raised a hand once and he stopped, not because he respected me all at once, because my face must have told him whatever version he had rehearsed no longer mattered. He went upstairs to shower. I sat with my list. The kitchen window over the sink had a little crack in the corner from when Daniel hit a baseball into the siding at 13. We had meant to replace it for years. Sun came through that crack in a thin, bright seam and lay across the table like a ruler. I remember thinking how strange it was that a flaw could make a line so clear. I did not cry anymore. Crying had belonged to the woman on the bench at the park. The woman at the table had something else to do. I pulled the file box from the hall closet and began sorting. Pay stubs, property tax notices, insurance papers, my mother's deed, the cottage key in a labeled envelope, statements from the joint account I had barely looked at because I trusted the man whose name sat beside mine. The numbers told their own story, transfers I hadn't approved. Cashier's checks I hadn't questioned, a balance lower than it should have been by a figure large enough to make my ears ring. I had been generous. Harold had been resourceful with my generosity. There is a difference. By noon I was at a credit union branch across town opening an account in my name only. The young woman behind the desk had pearl studs and a careful smile. She asked whether I wanted paper statements mailed to my home address. Not yet, I said. She nodded once, as if women telling partial truths in bank offices was something she saw every day. Maybe it was. On the way back I parked outside a strip mall and made one phone call from the car. Not to Rachel, not to Daniel, not to my sister who would have turned this into alarm before I was ready. I called an attorney whose number I got from the county bar referral line, a woman named Elaine Mercer with a voice so level it felt like dry ground. She gave me an appointment for Thursday at 9. I wrote the time on the back of a gas receipt. That afternoon I wrote a second list. It included passwords, documents, things to pack first, who had spare keys, which bills came from automatic withdrawal, and what I could live without. It was not a dramatic list, no line about revenge, no line about making anybody sorry. Practical lists are how some women save their own lives. I wasn't angry anymore, I was done. Nobody in that house knew what was happening because I had spent decades making my interior life invisible. For once, that skill belonged to me. The next 2 days moved with a peculiar stillness. Harold spoke carefully, as if he thought gentleness could substitute for truth. Rachel texted asking whether I wanted Owen to come by with a belated card. Daniel called once and hung up before voicemail picked up. I did my job. I answered emails. I put on lipstick. I folded laundry. Underneath each ordinary thing, another structure was being built. At Elaine Mercer's office downtown, I learned how useful plain language can be. She wore a navy suit and no wedding ring. Her conference room had a framed print of a lake in winter, all gray sky and hard water, which suited her perfectly. I laid out the papers. She read them without interrupting. Then she said, "You have options," in a tone that made the words sound factual, not comforting. I signed what needed signing. I asked what could be frozen, what could be protected, what belonged to me by deed and by law instead of by habit. What I didn't know yet, what I couldn't have known, was how powerful it would feel to hear my own name spoken in a room where no one expected me to give something away. By Friday, I had rented a small apartment over a florist on Watervliet month to month. The stairs were narrow, the windows high, the rent manageable. I told the manager I wanted the place immediately. He said the paint in the bedroom was still drying. I said I didn't care. There is a point when a person stops needing perfect conditions and starts needing an exit. I bought boxes at the hardware store with cash. I packed when the house was empty. Winter coat, tax records, my mother's recipe tin, the quilt my aunt pieced from old feed sacks, 2 pairs of sensible shoes, the photo album from before digital pictures made memory feel disposable. I left the heavy things, the ones that had only ever belonged to the house. By Sunday, I asked Harold, Rachel, and Daniel to meet me Monday morning at Elaine Mercer's office. "It's important," I said, nothing more. Harold asked whether this had to be done with the children there. I told him yes. Rachel wanted to know if Owen should come. I told her no. Daniel said, "Mom, can't we just talk at home?" I said, "Monday, 9:30. Then I hung up. My voice did not shake. Monday came bright and cold, the kind of clear morning that makes every edge in the world look sharpened. I wore a camel coat I hadn't bothered with in years because it seemed like too much trouble to keep brushed. I parked in the garage under the building and sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel, not in fear, just in acknowledgement. Some doors only open once, some close the same way. They were all already seated when I walked into the conference room. Harold at one end trying for composure, Rachel with her purse hugged tight against her ribs, Daniel forward on his forearms, restless as a teenage boy called into the principal's office. Elaine sat beside me, her file open, glasses low on her nose. Sunlight from the tall window hit the polished table and made the whole room look unforgiving in the best possible way. I took my seat and said, "I'm going first." Nobody argued. "The cottage in Selina is not for sale." I placed the deed on the table. "Any attempt to list it or discuss its sale without my written permission ends now." Harold opened his mouth. I kept speaking. "The joint account has been closed to new withdrawals. My paycheck goes elsewhere. Elaine will send copies of the financial review and proposed next steps to each of you by certified mail." My voice sounded calm enough to belong to another woman, but it was mine. "By Friday, movers will collect my belongings from Ashbury Lane. After that, further contact about property goes through council." Rachel stared at me. "Mom." I looked at her once. "You sat at that table." Her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse until her knuckles blanched. Daniel pushed back in his chair just enough for the legs to scrape. "Are you serious?" "Yes." Harold leaned forward with both palms flat. "Marion, this is absurd." Elaine turned one page. I did not look at her. I looked only at Harold. "No," I said. "What was absurd was leaving me in my own house while you made plans for what I had inherited." He blinked, then his jaw shifted the way it always had when he wanted to win by force of certainty. We were trying to solve a problem. "You were solving it with my life." Rachel's eyes filled, but she did not cry. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck and looked at the ceiling, then the carpet, then his hands. Harold sat back hard enough that the chair gave a small complaining sound. For the first time in years, nobody in my family seemed to know what role to hand me. I continued, "You will not come to the apartment uninvited. You will not ask Owen to carry messages. You will not call me to explain what I already saw." Harold said my name in the old warning tone, the one that used to stop me cold in kitchens, parking lots, church foyers. It did not work there. "I'm finished," I said. No speeches followed, no final appeal. Rachel covered her mouth. Daniel stared at the tabletop as if answers might appear in the grain. Harold's shoulders rose once, then lowered, the shape of a man realizing the ground beneath him had rules now. I stood, took my coat from the chair back, and walked to the door. My hand found the brass handle easily. Behind me, someone said, "Mom," but I didn't turn. I stepped into the hallway, and the door closed with a quiet seal that sounded more final than any shouting ever could. The first weeks on Watervliet were not peaceful. That is something people don't tell you. Freedom doesn't always feel like freedom at first. Sometimes it just feels like silence. The apartment had sloped floors and a radiator that hissed like an irritated old ant. Delivery trucks rumbled beneath the windows before dawn because the florist downstairs took fresh stock on Tuesdays and Fridays. I slept in strange patches, 2 hours, then awake, then another hour with dreams so ordinary they unsettled me more than nightmares would have. In one of them, I was always searching for a grocery list I had already finished using. In another, I was setting places for people who never arrived, though even in the dream I didn't wait long. My appetite changed too. For years I had cooked by appetite that belonged to other people, but now the question of what I wanted felt oddly technical. One night I ate cottage cheese standing over the sink with black pepper on top. Another evening I bought Thai takeout and laughed at myself for not knowing how spicy medium really was. Once I burned toast because I got distracted watching rain bead on the fire escape and realized with a start that no one would be disappointed but me. On Wednesday of my second week there, I found myself sitting cross-legged on the bare rug at 10:30 at night eating cherries out of a paper bowl while a detective show murmured from the laptop. That would have looked lonely to somebody else. To me it felt unassigned, a little wild, a little sad, a little clean. The old friendship that returned was Donna Ruiz. We had worked together years ago before she transferred to purchasing and then retired early to take care of her sister. Somewhere along the way, our lunches had given way to Christmas cards and then nothing much. She called after hearing through the company grapevine that I'd changed my direct deposit and updated my emergency contact. "That usually means either Vegas or divorce," she said, "and you are not a Vegas woman." I laughed for the first real time in weeks. We met at a diner near the interstate where the booths were cracked and the pie was better than it had any right to be. Donna did not pry, she listened. Then she slid the sugar dispenser away from the edge of the table and said, "You don't have to talk like a witness, you're allowed to just be hurt." There was relief in hearing that from somebody who wanted nothing from me, not soup, not money, not a key to the cottage, not reassurance I would smooth this over for everyone else. Some kindnesses arrive late enough to be believed. She had practiced the apology in the car 4 times. That was Rachel 3 days later, standing outside the florist with a scarf wound too tight around her throat. I only know because she told me before I could speak. She wanted to come upstairs. I told her we could walk instead. We went 1 block, maybe 2. She said she had thought Harold knew best. She said money had become such a panic around Daniel that everybody kept agreeing to the next bad idea because it sounded temporary. She said seeing me in that restaurant had made her feel like a child caught stealing. All of that may have been true. None of it changed what had happened. I did not forgive her on the sidewalk. I did not refuse her either. I said, I need different behavior, not better words. Then I went back upstairs alone. That was enough for one day. By early spring I had a rhythm, not the old one, not service disguised as duty, something smaller and more honest. I took a part-time bookkeeping job for a neighborhood hardware store 3 mornings a week because numbers were still numbers no matter what else had broken, and because I liked earning money that nobody else had pre-spent in their imagination. The owner, Mr. Choi, kept a bowl of clementines by the register and played classical radio low enough that it never asked for attention. I balanced invoices in the back office while customers carried out furnace filters and birdseed and paint rollers, ordinary life moving around me without needing anything personal. My new mornings began with a walk along the river path before work. No heroic exercise, just 30 minutes in decent shoes while geese argued on the bank and cyclists passed with that guilty speed people get when they know they are too close to pedestrians. I bought coffee from a kiosk once a week and sat on a cold stone ledge to drink it while the sun climbed over the warehouses. The small joy I reclaimed was reading, real R. Eating, not recipes, not school forms, not insurance fine print. I joined the library again and checked out novels with women on the covers who looked like they had secrets. I read them in bed with 1 lamp on and no obligation to stay awake for anyone's return. The physical anchor I remember from that season is a pair of yellow tulips on my windowsill, bought impulsively from the florist downstairs because one stem had bent sideways in a way I admired. They opened over 3 days, then dropped their petals all at once while I was at work. I came home to that bright little scatter and felt unexpectedly happy. Beauty had happened in the room whether or not anyone else saw it. The person I helped was a cashier named Tasha at the hardware store, 32 maybe, with a quick smile and the kind of tired eyes that don't belong to youth. One morning she rang up screws for a contractor, waited until the door shut, and asked if I knew any place cheap to print forms. Her voice had that careful flatness I recognized from the Mirror months earlier. I said the library did it for 10 cents a page. She nodded, then stood very still. He checks the bank app, she said, just that. Nothing else. I told Mr. Choi I was taking my break. I drove Tasha to the library, paid for the copies before she could protest, and waited outside while she handled whatever papers she needed. On the ride back, she kept staring through the windshield as if the world had become overbright. At a red light, she said, I thought maybe I was overreacting. I kept my hands on the wheel and answered, if you had to hide to do it, you probably weren't. She let out a breath that sounded like something unknotted. That exchange did not fix her life. It wasn't meant to. It simply placed one solid board over one shaky piece of ground. Sometimes that is enough to get a person to the next place she can stand. My relationship with the children changed by inches. Daniel entered a debt program through a credit counselor Elaine recommended, and for the first time in his adult life, stopped treating money as something that would be rescued at the last second by a parent who ate her own worry. Rachel began calling before she came over, then waiting for me to invite her in. Harold moved into a condo on the far side of town and sent messages that ranged from defensive to sentimental to stiffly practical. I answered the practical ones, the others I left alone. Not every opening deserves a response. There is a kind of warmth that arrives only after you stop bargaining with reality. Mine came slowly, in clean countertops that stayed clean because I was the only one using them, in a paycheck deposited where I expected it, in a Saturday afternoon nap taken because I was sleepy and not because I had collapsed between obligations, in the sound of my own laughter startling me at a radio host's dumb joke while I sliced pears for myself and no one else. What I didn't know yet, what I couldn't have known, was that peace would feel less like triumph and more like getting my own pulse back under my fingers. By the time autumn returned, I could pass my birthday aisle in the grocery store without feeling ambushed by candles and cake mixes. That surprised me. I had expected anniversaries to be louder. Instead, they came like weather fronts you can see on the horizon and prepare for if you have enough warning. I bought a butternut squash, a loaf of seeded bread, and a new wool scarf in a rust color Rachel said made my face look alive. She was trying, I saw that, I let myself see it. Owen grew taller. He started asking real questions, the kind children ask when they realize adults are not permanent whether but people making choices. One afternoon he sat at my little apartment table coloring a dinosaur and asked why Grandpa lived somewhere else now. I said, because sometimes grown people make a mess of the promises they made and then they have to live more honestly. He thought about that with the seriousness only children can bring to hard truths, then asked for another green crayon. We moved on, that felt right. I do not look back at my marriage as a waste. Waste is too simple a word for years that held births, mortgages, flu seasons, laughter in station wagons, and ordinary Tuesday suppers that were, at the time, exactly what I wanted. I look back and see a woman who confused being necessary with being cherished. I look back and see how often I rewarded taking by calling it need. I look back and see a family that learned my devotion so well they stopped seeing the person delivering it. Those are not the same thing as saying none of it mattered. It mattered, it just wasn't enough to keep. There are still evenings when the light in the apartment turns honey-colored around 5 and I feel a brief ache for the version of home I tried so hard to maintain. Not the actual rooms, not the people at their worst, just the idea of being expected in a place I believed was mine. Then the ache says, a kettle hums, a bus breaks out front, somebody downstairs laughs while moving buckets of daisies. Life continues in honest noises. Last month I drove to the cottage in Salina alone and opened it up for the season. The porch boards needed staining. A raccoon had gotten into the trash can by the shed. The lake was flat as hammered tin under a pale sky. I swept, aired the blankets, and stood on the dock until the wind pushed tears into my eyes, not sad tears, just weather. I thought about my mother there, about the wrist wrapped in a dish towel, about the way she kept moving because moving was sometimes the clearest prayer she had. I am older now than she was then. I understand more than I used to. If I say I am happy, I mean something quieter than people usually mean. I mean I can sit in a room and remain fully present to myself. I mean I no longer cook to earn my place. I mean when my phone rings, I answer because I choose to, not because I am bracing for the next demand. I mean my life fits the shape of my days now instead of the other way around. This year when my birthday came around again, I did not plan a dinner. I took the day off. I drove to a garden center outside Xenia and bought rosemary, mums, and a ceramic planter too heavy for one hand. I ate lunch at a roadside cafe where nobody knew my name. I came home with dirt under my nails and set the plants along the windowsill where the light was best. Evening arrived softly. I never once looked at the clock. People sometimes ask whether I'm lonely. The honest answer is sometimes yes, but loneliness is not the worst thing I have known. Being used without being seen was worse. Waiting in a bright house for people who had already chosen another room was worse. Shrinking so other people could continue feeling comfortable was worse. A person can live through loneliness and stay intact. That matters. Now when night settles over the street and the florist downstairs pulls in the last chalkboard sign, I lock my own door, wash one plate, and leave it drying by the sink. Then I turn out the light and go on with my life.